happening at the founding of the United States is we have the Bank of England attempting to proliferate its banking system over here. The purposes are obvious: exploitation, which is obviously going to be terminal exploitation, and whether anyone realizes it or not, that's the consequence. Jefferson stood against this in principle, but the founders didn't have a solution, so they didn't. They would have written the Constitution differently. We wouldn't have been given. They wouldn't have attempted to assert that an abstract unit called a dollar should have a perpetual value of so many, grains of silver or gold. And the basic math that invalidates that is very simple. You have basically finite quantity of gold. Yes, it increases some every year, but very little compared to what industry has increased all the while since then. And the thing is, if that circulation is even right in the beginning to sustain what industry you have, growing beyond that, you understand from the example that I just gave you of 1,000 people in a circle, you confound industry to a tremendous degree by depriving it of very little of the circulation that it needs to be able to sustain all possible trade. You force people to work more, and so on and so forth. But it's a great deal of injustice which we don't really tend to perceive it. People just accept life because for some reason that little intellectual challenge that we've discussed in whatever an hour and a half so far, that little intellectual challenge is too much work to assimilate. Instead, they would rather spend their life paying 4 homes for every home that they occupy for 20 years, for their entire life, So instead of doing the work to produce 1 home, they do the work to produce 4 homes over and over and over again. And not just for homes, but for everything that they procure and for all the taxes that they pay to government. So they're working, literally hundreds of times as much as they need to work because they don't want to spend an hour and a half thinking, this just got explained to me, and no one can invalidate it. No reasonable person thinks that they've invalidated this proposition of mathematically perfected economy in 40 years, And so you listen to this and you think, oh, well, I'd rather turn on the TV and pay, on this house that's going to be foreclosed on me in 6 months here or a year, So anyway, as we were saying, William was saying, during the break, the history gets pretty interesting, but there's just a few highlights on it, and I used to have this whole history. In fact, this is what the Money Masters emulated, and I've taken this work down to deprive the plagiarists of certain things which show in how you present the history that you don't understand what you're arguing for. I mean, does it make sense to have literally millions of websites, which are silly regurgitations of the same story? I mean, people used to plagiarize my work so bad you'd find thousands of copies of like Louis T. McFadden's June 15th, 1932 congressional address. You'd find thousands of copies of them online all over the world, complete with my subtitles that I added and reduced, not including the very parts that I excluded because they're so lengthy and boring, and don't tell you, much of anything, And it's the plagiarism is so out of control that you have no idea who originally had this idea, but now all of a sudden, 40 years down the road, everybody is talking as if, we all understand that interest is detrimental. And to give you an example of how wrong that can be, I mean, I was just people can be in that. Over the last few days, I've been asked to help out in some arguments on some forums. I won't mention names and places and where these things went, but we had a detractor claiming that banks don't launder principal into their possession, citing Wikipedia as a reference, when the first paragraphs of the very article he cites explains that central banks create the money and do so by purchasing financial assets, which is, of course, a purposely ambiguous explanation, but it does equate to a fact of laundering principal into their possession. Further paragraphs later say that commercial banks lend money by overdraft. Now, of course, anyone who's accustomed to interpreting legal language knows that these things have to be explained very carefully, and of course we know that Wikipedia is a public wiki. Anyone can contribute to it. And then this guy is claiming that what applies to these commercial banks is further qualified by a further author. He doesn't even say who they are and where the article comes from. But this other person claims that most money is created by commercial banks and that they destroy the principal. Well, anyone can write that, and that kind of information didn't even exist until, I started to there's things that I've held to my chest for a long time about, in particular, this obfuscation of the currency. So this will be the new wave of plagiarists, but there's no one in the world who articulates these things like I do, and who's able to discuss them. It's very obvious who's the original, author of all these things still. Anyway, so the thing is, this person is claiming at once to pay tribute to me that I'm absolutely correct that interest multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation into terminal failure. Then they claim that I'm wrong, and it's just an ego trip. They're trying to prove to themselves that they know more than I do, that I'm wrong, and they're calling me names and all kinds of abusive behaviors going on. Anyway, so here's what's so humorous even about this, but which tells you yet how destructive all this behavior is. So he claims to understand this thesis of inevitable failure, yet he's claiming that the banks don't launder the principal into their possession, that instead they destroy it. But this is not even what's said in Wikipedia. Of course, money that's lent by overdraft, the only reason you would have to mention that it's by overdraft is you're explicitly excluding creation. Creation is not to be interpreted by lending at overdraft. You had $5 and you lent the $5 to person A, and you also lent it to person B, and you also lent it to person C. You didn't create any money. Yes, you added money to the books, you see, but because you didn't create, would you destroy the $5 that you had when person A pays it back? Obviously not. No. So what is the accounting matter there? No, as it's paid off, yes, it no longer exists on the books, but there wasn't even anything to retire from circulation. Yes, you're allowing them to circulate it as if they had it, but that's an obfuscation itself. And of course, if peripheral banks were allowed to create money, this would have the capacity to completely nullify any ability that the central banks have to control the amount of circulation. So it's preposterous on any level to presume that this other article is accurate, which claims that almost all money is created by commercial banks. There's no evidence in the very article this person cited that any creation occurs at all. And then that they destroy it, there was nothing to destroy. So this other article is, it doesn't concur the main site of these claims. So just to give you an example of how destructive this is, so a whole forum goes haywire because of one person's 100 derogatory, idiotic assertions and purpose misinterpretation of very explicit language in cases. And he never answered one of my questions once, and I was called into this forum to rescue the authors of it. What's going on here? This guy's quoting the director of the Bank of Canada and everything, and they needed me to sort it all out. So I came in, and it was really quite obvious. It's routine process. But in all this pretentiousness of this person who's trying to, he claims to support me until then, anyway, they claim to understand this thesis of failure. And so I said then, I'm basically giving him a free rein to justify his assertions. I said, so if you understand this thesis of inevitable failure then, and you're saying the central banks, which is not what's explained in the cites, and I've clearly articulated this like 5 or 6 or 7 times by this point, I said, so if you understand this thesis of inevitable failure, and the banks are not laundering principal into their possession, then tell me, what rate of interest would be necessary to engender terminal failure? And that question got asked him about 7 times in a few days, and he never answered it once. So what does it tell you about what people really understand this? The thing is, you have to understand it exactly. And then history hits several important points. The first is the founding of the country, which evidently there was a struggle over banking, but there wasn't any solution. If you have solution, you have the omnipotent arguments, because as I've explained, there is one and one only solution for inflation and deflation. There's one and one only solution for maldisposition. There is one and one only solution for inherent irreversible multiplication of artificial indebtedness, and therefore there is one integral solution, likewise, for systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. A fact of one and one only mathematically perfected economy, one and one only solution. So the founders didn't have that because no one can argue against those arguments. It's as simple as a squared plus b squared equals c squared. When you understand the proof of it, anyone who wants to claim anything else is off the wall. So anyhow, the founders didn't have solution, or we would have had it in the Constitution. And in fact, they embedded a very, very serious fault in the Constitution in attempting to attach a relatively finite quantity of monetary reserves in gold and silver to the ostensible value of $1. Mathematically perfected economy allows actual free markets to determine the value of $1. So then we go on to Andrew Jackson. And I published this history in my, brief account of United States history. And Jackson is, once people start to understand this, they think that Jackson was some kind of a hero for, putting the second Bank of the United States out of commission. Well, the only evidence that exists is that Jackson had personal controversies with the bankers, and if he had monetary resolution was his motivating factor, he would have realized that it would have accomplished nothing to merely decommission the principal bank, or central bank as we call it today, the second Bank of the United States. And he said, you are a den of vipers and thieves, and and he vowed to rout them out, and he did rout them out. Well, but yet he only served one term in office. During that term, financial conditions worsened. He left the same obfuscation. See, if every stone in the Great Pyramid could produce this obfuscation of the currency, and you remove the capstone, the central bank, leaving every other stone to produce however much of this obfuscation of the currency, you have no effect, you see. And so the evidence is that Jackson's reaction to the banks was just personal, on personal issues, and that in fact it wasn't a matter of monetary resolution at all. Yes, like